and final presenter is Dr. Aziz. Dr. Aziz is an associate professor at the American School of Professional Psychology at Grossi University in Northern Virginia. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Aziz.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh, you're all awake still? Well, the credit goes to you. Thank you so much for hanging in there. And thank you for allowing me to speak very briefly about my recent study that I did on acculturation experiences of the first and second generation of Muslim Afghan women. And it's a phenomenological study. And let me tell you why I believe in phenomenological study qualitative. I believe in personal story. I believe in lived experiences that people share, and I also believe that this particular way of doing research will allow me and also give me the tremendous honor to listen to people's stories and let them also know that there are people who actually can take with their permission their stories and share with the bigger audience. And so I have their permission, obviously IRB and everything went through, and I also asked for the participants' permission to allow me to share some of their specific narratives in this study that I did. Also, I wanted to share with you that I am originally from Afghanistan. I am a refugee and a survivor and thriving. So basically meaning that, thank you. This is not about me, by the way, but I think this is what's really important to share with you, that as to why is it that we do research and what is that we do, and what drives us, right? What motivates us. And growing up in different countries as a refugee and going through many, many different transitions, I always wondered, what makes a person survive through all these adjustments, through all these transitions, and why is it that someone survives and thrives, another one is stuck? So those are the questions that I'm still exploring, and I don't have all the answers, but I hope that through these personal stories I will finally somehow little by little get there. Also, I believe that through transitioning into different countries, people go through what's called by Barry 1994, acculturation, and that's really a process. Basically, acculturation is a process of adjustment to a new host country, and it takes tremendous. There are many factors that can contribute to a successful acculturation, and of course, I'm not going to talk about it due to the time constraints. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is the Afghan immigrants and refugees in the U.S. alone. I'm just going to focus on that because we know that my own relatives, they are spread in 5 different continents. So as a refugee, that's the lived experience and the reality. I will be talking to you about the objective of the study, methodology, emerged themes, analysis, a summary, and recommendation. Just very briefly, as to those who don't have a lot of knowledge or information about who Afghans are, we're very famous, by the way, right now, right? As you can speak, and also we get bombs overnight, over and over, dropped on us. So anyways, I don't want to make it into a political discussion. However, it's very important to understand the waves of refugees coming to the United States. The very first wave arrived in the 1980s, and that was due to the Russian invasion in Afghanistan. The second wave occurred in the mid-1990s because of the civil war and the emergence of the Taliban. And then the third wave was after 9/11, the U.S. invasion. And primarily those who arrived in the U.S. were because of relatives or translators and families and so on that were allowed to come in with a specific visa, but also widows, for example. So what did I want to achieve through this study? What are the objectives? The objective was to understand the immigration and acculturation experiences of the first and second Muslim Afghan generation of Afghan women. And what types of psychological adjustments have they had to make during this process? So those are the 2 main kind of guiding questions that influenced my study. Ray did a fantastic job in terms of explaining the aspect of methodology and phenomenological study, but I'm going to just briefly note that I chose the interpretive phenomenological analysis, or IPA, and particularly to describe the lived experiences of the first and second generation of Afghan women. Gain qualitative narrative data. I believe that they're very quite different, because we saw Dr. Badr did showing numbers, but I also wanted to know their stories behind those numbers, right? So this is a very good combination. Also to bear witness if there was any social injustice that have occurred, that I actually bear witness, and I'm witnessing their narratives about their lived experiences. So in many ways, it's a participatory action research, or PAR. And also it's atheoretical, so I don't have any specific sets of assumptions or theory to start with. And but basically, the person himself or herself is making sense out of his lived experience and situation. The selection of the participants there were about 6 women, basically 3 couples, mother-daughter, right? And the specific criteria that they had to meet were, first of all, they had to identify as an Afghan Muslim woman, and as well as between the ages of 18 to 60 years of age, and have lived in the US for a minimum of 10 years. And the adult daughters were either born in the US or in Afghanistan, but immigrated as a child to the US or adolescent. So those are very specific criteria that I had to give out in order to for them to be selected. Demographics, the very basic chart showing that the age of M1, D1, mother 1, daughter 1, and mother 2, daughter 2. And so the age was between 43 to 59 of mothers, and the daughters were between 21 and 35. Marital status, for the most part, the daughters, we had a married woman with single daughter, married woman, divorced daughter, and married woman and divorced. So there were the second generation, actually, I had 2 daughters that were divorced. And then years in the US, minimum of 17 and on. Interestingly enough, these mother-daughter arrived just before September 11, 2001. So they have been here for 17 years, and quite interesting in terms of comparing also their perceptions of the US, those who arrived here a lot earlier and those who arrived here just recently. Occupation, homemaker, the mother 1, student with a daughter who is student, she's pretty young, 21, a mother who was a nurse, and the daughter who was a lawyer. And interestingly enough, as you see, the higher the level of education, somehow they're also the higher risk for divorce. But I don't wanna, that was not the focus of my study. Birthplace, most of them were born in Kabul, one in Kandahar, Herat, and another one in Herat. Now, how I did, the analysis of the data, obviously I met with all 6 of them individually and interviewed them and audio taped their interviews in a very private room. And prior to that, consent were given and obtained, and IRB was given. And once they were done, then I transcribed, very, very labor-intensive process, transcribed all the interviews. For each interview, it was about 6 or 7 hours of transcription, to be exact. And then I sent back those transcriptions to each one of the participants to make sure that they would validate and that it would give me their final blessing that, in fact, I can go ahead and use them for the purpose of sharing the information here. Now, bracketing in phenomenological study refers to my own kind of experience. So what comes up for me as a researcher, as a co-researcher? And obviously there is no such thing in my view as complete objective researcher, right? So we all bring our own some subjectivity in this whole process. And then what clustering of units of meaning to form themes, and summarizing each interviews individually, and then comparing each one, and then horizontalization, which basically means that I lay them out and then basically try to find themes based on their transcripts, interviews. So the mothers, what emerged, what theme were identified from the mothers' interviews? There were about 6 themes that emerged from these interviews. One is every single one of the first generation Afghan women talked about traumatic experiences, exposure to war, right? So because they're all, they were refugees and they escaped. None of them actually came legally, they had to escape. Losses and grief and depression, identity, building a community and family providing protection, adapting to America, but maintaining your culture. These are the 6 themes that emerge from those experiences. And so, for example, one talked about, I witnessed the killing of my father. He was killed in a bomb attack in Kabul. For 2 decades, I was depressed and could not make sense of this horrific incident. Another one said, I lost 7 members of my family over 10 years due to the war in Afghanistan. My family became the sole source of help for all these family members who had lost their breadwinner, basically. So as you can see, there are different intergenerational traumas, and then the loss of one person can have impact on so many different communities and families and so on. The next theme that emerged was loss, grief, and depression. One shared with me, the most difficult experience for me was when I became a refugee and did not have anyone to talk to. I was depressed. So the social isolation, alienation, coming to a different country, you think that everything is now awesome, but of course it's not always the case. So people, in fact, go through depression, social isolation, and also embarrassment and shame. Now that I am in a safe place, what's wrong with me? Why am I still feeling very much affected by these experiences? Identity, intersectionality, who am I really? Am I an Afghan woman? Am I a Muslim? Am I Afghan American? Am I a mother? And then, so all of these experiences that emerge that will create a sense of kind of confusion. Building a community was mentioned by every single one of these participants in terms of what helped them to cope with that acculturation. Is that I love my neighbors, whether they were Afghans or not. I would bring food to them and I want to share with them because that was important to me. And then, of course, they create their own community, whether they were, white American community or Afghan Muslim. As you know, there are not many Afghan Muslims in the U.S., so therefore, they had to create their own community in order to make sense. So the love of Afghan mothers, one shared with me, is something that so many people around the world don't share. And of course, what she was referring to that by that was, that she had a really, really hard time to letting go of her children, to let them venture out and, and for them to have their own way. Adapting, maintaining, many said that yes, we want to adapt to this in this country, however, we also want to maintain our own tradition and culture and so on, because this is how we can survive, this is how we can, continue our culture. Now, some of the themes that emerged from the daughters' interviews were intergenerational miscommunication, identity, again, also the daughters went through this, divided cultural experiences, competing cultural values, rebelliousness, how many of us have gone through this, taking from mother, and building self-confidence. So, I know that I'm really, really short on time, but let me just tell you that intergenerational miscommunication was one of the biggest biggest issue that came in my research, and that was, parents did not understand the daughters particularly. There were double standards versus, sons and daughter, and so there was that aspect of like who I am and why is it that my parents don't understand me. The other thing is that they said that yes, you have survived the wars, but we also have suffered. So therefore, our problem, our pain is basically no less. Intersectionality, again, am I American, am I Muslim, woman, American, Afghan, all of that was very much present. And divided cultural experience in terms of growing up. I had a very torn identity between being American and Afghan. I think being American was always something that was looked down upon in their family, but then the friends usually criticized as to why are you not American enough. Competing cultural values, and then rebelliousness is really like, going against the parents and, rebelling basically as part of being a teenager, which is a normal task. And then finally, which really is an amazing journey in this aspect, is that taking from mothers. So even though we rebel against our mothers, for some reason we go back and we actually, learn in, unconsciously or consciously, and then come back and then reconcile basically, and building confidence and moving on. So in summary, Muslim Afghan women experience several psychological distress in the process of acculturation due to the previous war trauma. Stories of pain, depression, and grief emerge in both generations. Thank you for being very patient with me. And stories of courage, and I put it in big letters because these are courageous women. And the survival and thriving were also named. And the daily news, of course, every day. Yesterday, I was bombarded with all the calls from my family. Are you okay? Are your parents? Are your family members okay because of the recent bombing and so on? So this is a daily struggle for many people. It's just arriving in the host country is not enough. It goes on forever. So my recommendation is basically to listen to the stories and the intergenerational trauma that we as clinicians, as researchers, need to pay enough attention, there's not enough attention paid to that. So in practice, we need to really ask for those experiences and tell me about your trauma, not specifically trauma, what happened to you, right? As opposed to why, mostly the what and how is this for you? And then finally, although Muslim refugee women may share certain common experiences, there are many differences in terms of lived experiences. So just because, I talk in general about Afghan women, but everyone is different. Every woman's story is different and in many ways unique, and we need to be able to listen to all of them. And so thank you for your invitation.
Thank you.
You just noticed there was discrimination.
Yes.
I protest.
How are you?
All right, so now we have about 10 minutes for question and answer. So if anybody has a question, I don't know if there's anyone around that. You can just raise your hand.
Yes, because everybody remember your.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a slide that you skipped past, and I saw the word refugee when you were talking about substance use. Just quickly, did you notice any particular patterns there?
Yeah, good question. So the rest of that quote was, which is good you're asking about this one because I did that interview. And so that was a participant discussing the difference between substance use in his views among refugees versus Jordanians. So we didn't ask a lot of questions about refugees because we didn't interview refugees. But what he said was that because this was someone who was an aid worker, he works in one of the camps, and he said that within the camps, it's something that's much more hidden, and it's much more used for coping. Whereas what he sees in the community is that it's very much more aggressively engaged. Like people are angry if they witness it in small towns, and they take actions against it in cities, like calling the police. And it's also used more recreationally outside of the camps. So that was sort of his insight into that question. He was distinguishing for me. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I have a limitation slide. Yeah, so our recruitment, I guess in general, there are definitely limitations to our research. Is more of a casual survey because our recruitment was from the volunteers and community members that we were engaging with through our trainings. And so for some of those trainings, we had translators, and for some, we conducted them in English. And so the people that we were interviewing were English-speaking Jordanians.
That's actually very similar to my question for Dr. Aziz. So for your narrative study, what language did you use?
Excellent question. So with mothers, they all spoke in Farsi, and that's my native tongue. I do speak a little bit of Pashto, but I'm not well versed, so I understand better. But the daughters were all English speaking. And then I had to translate everything, all the into English, and then transcribe, and then send back the transcription in Farsi back to the mother so they could read and give me the.
My question is actually following the thing I was saying, the gender, marriage status, and depression. The research that I had studied previously showed that married women have higher rates of depression versus unmarried men. That's what I wanted to know.
Married.
So depression rates are higher in unmarried men, but married women.
Yeah.
So did you see that difference?
No, we did not see that.
So basically, there was no gender difference.
Gender was not a factor, and even with interaction, gender, male married, female married, that did not come up.
Okay.
So, but married versus not married, in this case, actually, all the not married, they are either divorced, widowed, separated. So there is no single, for example, and and when we did the differences between the groups, they were the same, and that's when we combined them together as one group, married versus not married. And then same thing for the men and women. So there was not at all interaction.
Another just quick comments for Naya. So you mentioned you were talking about higher level of education and rate of divorce. I'm wondering if that falls in the same way rebelling from a patriarchal culture.
Yes. They talked about, even though that was not the focus of my study, but it kind of appeared that way. It's like, the higher education, masters and, over, above, there was, I think, the economic independence, and also the issue about what they have observed in their own family. For example, there was a lot of talk about domestic violence. And really talking about a lot of anger was also present in terms of blaming the mother, right? But then they realized that she could only do so much. There's a whole concept of when you suffer, then why don't you get out of this? It's not that easy. And so and two of them shared with me that they had really low tolerance for any kind of inequality in the marriage. And so, and they were a little bit hypersensitive to that issue of verbal, emotional abuse.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good.
Thank you for sharing your work. It's very cool to see the qualitative and the quantitative together, and hopefully in the future we'll see more mixed model research. So as the qualitative research was being presented, then you reflect what other variables to be looked at with quantitative research. So my question actually to Dr. Abeleda is twofold. One is recruitment. The recruitment of the participants in the U.S. was mostly Moss-based, and which obviously has its own biases. My first question is.
And community centers.
And community centers. Okay. Yeah. So I'm wondering, in terms of, how comparable as those population, those samples, is Moss-based and community-based versus, I'm not sure how the recruitment was in Jordan and other countries.
Jordan and Egypt were also community centers, but the community centers, I was not personally there, my other two colleagues were there. They are not the same as we have here. And that's the last slide I had, the limitation, I think you said limitations. And if you remember, I did not even mention the word generalizability. But even in the previous study, I did a study in Utah, which are Mormons, definitely, I mean, that whole sample. We did a study with African American. These main factors, the last slide where they have everything together, like the economic resources, emotional balance, the gender factor, they will come almost in every sample. So the gender came in the Egypt-Jordan sample alone. It also came in the U.S. sample again. So it came also in the Mormon sample, in the African American. But definitely, I mean, there are again the other thing that I did not mention, the Arabs. Remember, this is not all Muslims. There are also Christian. We did not even mention that. There are many limitations. I mean, it's hard to reach these populations, especially in the U.S. It took us at least a year to get the 70 cases. It took us 2 months to get the sample from Jordan and Egypt. So there are too many issues that we can point. These are limitations.
And then my second question, and this is informed by the qualitative research, were you guys able to look at variables such as acculturation, isolation, trauma history, any of those variables in your model?
Actually, in my publication, I have an article that's called The Impact of Acculturation Among Older American Muslims, 2011, you can find that. And the culture, those who identify with their heritage culture. So if you are Afghan, then the Afghani culture, or Palestinian, they have much higher depression than those who assimilated or already acculturated in them. Which is interesting. I mean, these are old people. They like to stay with their own culture. So I'm not very surprised, but this is one of the main factors that was there. And that's why I called the article acculturation, the depression.
All right, we're going to actually call it for question and answer. So thank you very much. Let's give another round of applause to our presenters.
Can I take a picture with all of you?